Welcome, everyone. My name is Selena Middleton, and I'm Stelliform Press's publisher and editor-in-chief. Stelliform Press is a small press focused on climate fiction and environmental stories. But before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So working to reform Western culture's relationship to the environment demands that settlers acknowledge that we are uninvited guests on the land. As settlers, we must shape our behavior with that knowledge and recognize that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have a vast knowledge of these lands that is both scientific and spiritual. Then we have to go beyond mere acknowledgement. So I'm a settler and I live and run Stelliform Press on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement. The wampum uses the symbols of a dish to represent the territory and one spoon to represent the people share the resources of the land and only take what they need. And this is an ethic that we need now and in the future. And the first step towards that future is taking seriously the treaties and agreements that settler nations made with Indigenous nations, and then considering how we can extend the spirit of those agreements and relationships into other parts of our lives. So I encourage everyone present and anyone who's watching this later to get to know your treaties if you're on treaty lands and seek out local Indigenous and Black-led environmental justice movements and support them in any way you can. So we're gathered online from so many different places all over the world today. Many of us from Canada and the United States, but also Europe and Asia. Our author, Dennis Mombauer, is a German living in Sri Lanka. Dennis, I will introduce you to the audience and then ask you to give us a little bit of an update on what's happening in Sri Lanka right now, which many of us in North America might not know about. So Dennis Mombauer lives in Colombo, Sri Lanka, where he works as a consultant on climate change and as a writer of weird fiction and textual experiments. He's a co-publisher of a German magazine for experimental fiction. His first English novel, The Fertile Clay, is coming out with Nightscape Press. He has also published a collection of short stories, The House of the Dark Whale. So Dennis, we did a bit of maneuvering to set this launch up, a few layers of contingency plans. Can you give folks a sense of what's going on in Sri Lanka right now?
Yeah, of course, without going into too much detail. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm very happy that people have turned up and very excited to share a bit about the novella. And yeah, so I'm living in Sri Lanka. I've been here for the last five and a half years. And at the moment, Sri Lanka is going a bit through challenging times. There's a very difficult economic situation. We're having daily power cuts. There's a lack of availability of fuel, so vehicles can't really travel. And many basic commodities are limited in availability, and there's like very high inflation on top of also protest situation and different developments. So I don't want to go into like the whole background, but a lot of people are suffering in the country, especially those that don't have like a high income or like earn in dollars. So many of, especially daily wage earners, especially like people driving tuk-tuks, driving cabs, working in daily jobs, have very limited income, and they can buy very limited things. So we are hoping that in the coming months, maybe things will stabilize a bit. There has been now a new president and prime minister who have been selected day before yesterday and yesterday. So now this might bring stability, hopefully. We'll see how it develops in the next weeks. But yeah, it is a bit challenging, and I'm very happy that for the timing also we were able to find something that accommodates both the time in Sri Lanka, but also the fact that the power cuts make it difficult to join things. So I moved actually this is not the house I live in, it's a different building with a generator. I moved before the evening to take this, because otherwise it's a bit unpredictable. And the internet also goes down when the power goes out. But yeah, so much maybe a very short background. I think we come back to this a bit later when we come to the dialogue portion also.
Thanks so much. I'm really hoping that we don't need our plan B and that you'll get to enjoy your book launch. If anyone is wanting to help out with mutual aid funds, donations, or even just helping to boost those mutual aid funds, check out the blog post by Vajraj Chandrasekhara, who's a writer, a very good writer, science fiction mostly, and we'll put that into the chat. I also want to introduce Mike Arnzen, who will be leading the interview portion of the launch. Award-winning author and writing professor Mike Arnzen was born in Amityville, New York. That is the hometown of the infamous horror house, so very appropriate to have him with us here today. Arnzen received the Bram Stoker Award for his novel Grave Markings, as well as for his newsletter Gorlitz, for Freakcidents, his poetry collection, and for his short story collection Proverbs for Monsters. That's amazing. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Mike. All right, so we'll launch right into our author reading. The novella we're celebrating is one that uses the weird and uncanny to raise the issue of climate change and also the still present effects of colonization in Sri Lanka. It was the structure of the book that first drew me to it, as it was this twisted upside down nature of the house itself that shapes how the story is told. And I thought that that was not only a profoundly smart storytelling move, but also a brilliant critique of what climate change is doing currently to the world. So the novella takes place on the island of Sri Lanka, focusing on a colonial mansion between the forest and the paddy fields, where a caretaker arrives with 4 children after pledging to keep them safe. When violent thugs storm the house, demanding that Ushu repay his debt, young Jasmeet and the other children hide in an upstairs bathroom where a running tap opens a gateway to escape. But the dry house is not the only force at work in the place where the forest and the estate meet. Something else stirs in the trees, something ancient, something that demands retribution. So the Sat mother bides her time, watching and learning from the house's inhabitants. She burrows beneath the foundations of the dry house, hungry for atonement. Pulled between these warring powers, Jasmeet must choose between saving those trapped in the mansion's bulging stomachs and preparing the house for when the mother emerges again. So I will put a link in the chat to a PDF document if anyone in the audience wants to follow along with the text as Dennis reads. Dennis, I will pass the stage to you to read from the book, and feel free to give a little bit of context, as I believe the part that you're reading isn't from the beginning of the book.
Thank you so much. And so basically what I want to read is a part that is from actually the 4th act of the book. There are different characters in the book who are living in the house and coming to the house. Already mentioned are the 4 children in the house, but there are also other people in different times entering the house. And in the 4th act, there's a young woman called Ayomi. She is searching for traces of her father, and she is coming to the house and encountering its mysteries. And so I will read an excerpt from that chapter. And hopefully it's not too confusing, but then again, even if you read the book in order, I think there's always an element of confusion since the structure is a bit upside down like the house. So yeah, I'll jump right in, and hopefully my German accent doesn't make it too hard to understand what I'm reading. All right. Mandari, right? At the woman's invitation, Ayomi entered the house and made her way to the couch. The floor was earthen, a single ceiling fan whirled overhead. Not enough to clear the suffocating heat. Thank you for inviting me. May I sit? Please, Mandari said with a welcoming gesture, pressing her hands together with fingers pointed upward. The middle-aged farmer then disappeared into the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of tea. Here, for you. Thank you. Ayomi stirred the liquid, watching milk and tea swirl together. I don't want to take up a lot of your time, it's a very personal matter for me. My father, Ushinta, He lived in the big house for years, and I never knew about it. Ayumi struggled to find the right words. For years, she whispered. Hari, how can I help you? I've never met this man. I'd barely been born when he came here. He took care of 4 children. Ayumi placed the photo on the low coffee table between them. While my mother and I lived on the other side of the country. If you can share anything you know about that time, please, I would really appreciate it. Of course, Mandari nodded. I didn't know your father or those children, but my mother did. You've heard the story? How people came to look for them and they had disappeared? Amma believed that the children were hiding in the house long after the people left, after your father left as well. Ayumi frowned. How could they have hidden there alone? How could they have survived? Well, there are 2 stories, Mandari said, sipping her tea. People around Anathakandu, they say the children were hiding in the forest behind the house, that the forest protected them. Ayumi remembered sitting on her veranda seat, staring out at the black wall of the nocturnal jungle, the uncanny noises that emanated from it. But even more unsettling, the memory of the pulse, that strange presence on the veranda. She swallowed. The forest? The stepmother of Anathakandu. Mandari didn't provide any explanation, and Ayumi wasn't sure she needed one. Others claim that the house has hidden rooms and passageways that connect to a secret chamber, and the children got lost there. My mother believed the house took them in, and it never let them back out. But surely there's another explanation. Ayumi sat back on the couch. She wasn't sure what to make of Mandari and her stories, her face with its strange marking. Both of these seem, unbelievable. There's a third possibility, but you won't like it. The woman placed her teacup on the table. Maybe those kids died in the house. Maybe that man did something to them. That's what the village people say. People don't just vanish, right? Ayumi closed her eyes. If her father and the kids had died, she would get no answers. Not now, not ever. But how? Do you know where Oshinta moved to, where he went after this? No idea, I'm sorry. Ayumi rose from the couch and straightened her shirt to hide her disappointment. Thank you. You've helped me a lot. She shook Mandari's hand and turned to leave. Outside, the trishaw driver had found a shaded spot near the main road, beside a Department of Agriculture sign announcing an experimental planting of drought-tolerant seeds. Ayumi crossed the paddies, flagging under the weight of her unanswered questions and the heat of the scorching sun. Only after she stepped into the trishaw and gestured the driver forward, after the stifling breeze of the momentum had dried her skin, did she realize she had left the photo on the table at the farmhouse. The jungle watched Ayumi. She knew that was impossible, but she had no other way to understand it. That feeling that tingled on her skin. Whenever she moved on the veranda, the leaves at the forest's boundary swayed, and the branches rustled with what felt like feeling, that knowledge of being watched, crept up behind her, proliferated blind spot. That modes of feeling for us. She took so dash, keeping her eyes trained to the soil worn rough, but when she had turned to make her way back to the house, the forest had surrounded her, nearly swallowing the trail, her only way home.
Dennis, I'm going to stop your video because it's breaking up a little bit. So hopefully we'll be able to hear you better without the video.
Okay, I think we have experienced the first technical difficulty. You can hear me again, right?
Yes.
Okay, I hope I wasn't gone for long. I don't know why, I think the connection cut. Okay, so, but when she turned to make her way back to the house, the forest had surrounded her, nearly swallowing the trail, her only way home. Either the stepmother was real, or Ayumi was losing her mind. In the daytime, she wandered the house and left a trail of flaking skin. She was worried her mind had become similarly brittle. She rubbed her arms and flinched as she touched one of the open sores that had come of her too frequent scratching. Her skin scratched over her bones like the canvas of a tent. She was always thirsty, and she couldn't sleep. She couldn't remember how many days she'd been here. The rooms had become familiar, as had the visits to Mandari's place out in the paddies. It was the farthest Ayumi ventured from the house now, the closest she got to town. Maybe she shouldn't have stayed in the house alone for so long. Maybe she should have commuted with the Trisha man. It might have been better for her to have some distance from the place, from her father's lingering presence. She had shaken out the old bed sheets, swept the room she had taken as her own, but still she lay awake at night, wheezing into the dusty dark, listening to the scratching at the windows, watching the surreptitious motion at the forest edge, the pale brightness creeping through the grass. Before she came here, Ayumi had studied maps of the area, had seen the forest as a lush green tongue reaching into the fields. She had followed the streams with her finger, a network of blue lines, and she had read the names of the surrounding villages. Now she was inside the forest, and geography had become meaningless. In the middle of the day, 5 minutes from the house, she was lost, surrounded by shimmering leaves and the never-ending corridors of tree trunks. She shouldn't know where the house was, or how she should get back. But then, why would she want to get back? The canopies of the trees filtered most of the sun's rays, and palm bushes hanging over the trail blocked out the remaining light. The warm, wet twilight of the forest formed a cocoon around her, a second skin that slithered over her shoulders. She had heard it before, a rhythmic sound that sometimes reverberated over the veranda at night. That strange rattling. But in the forest it was louder, more insistent, a hollow banging of metal against metal, a quick percussion like beads falling to the floor. A kind of call to which the forest responded. Nightjars croaked. Branches rustled under the weight of scrambling bodies. Below the trees, Ayumi listened, waited for the sound to close in on her. She didn't know if she should be afraid, but hope welled up in her. The stepmother knew the forest. She knew the house like the roots of trees know a mountain. Maybe she should know something about her father too. "I'm Ayumi," she whispered. "My father sheltered the children when they needed protection. I believe you did the same when he no longer could." The roots of the great hora trees trembled, their lengths covered in a pallid rash. The rattling drum beat reverberated between them, and Ayumi pushed through branches sticky with resin to step towards the sound. "I know you've looked after the people of the forest for a long time. I know you're not to be feared, that you're not a monster. It was you on the veranda, wasn't it, the first night I came? You didn't harm me?" The trees opened into a narrow clearing, bordered with rocks and cultivating a strange, colorless grass. A man with a spoon sat in the middle of a semicircle of tin cans. Ayumi stopped, suddenly afraid. He was haggard and naked, covered in a thick beard and burgeoning body hair that sprouted from his chest, his armpits, his arms and legs. "She won't speak to you, Auntie," the man said, raising the spoon he held in his right hand, as if in contemplation. With his other hand, he reached into the can closest to him and fished out a smooth stone or seed and held it up into a ray of light. Dropping the object back into the can, he hit the metal with his spoon and turned his ear towards the noise as it rattled amidst the trees. "But you're right. She saved me. The others didn't want to come, Jasmine and the twins. They stayed with Uncle Ushu. They didn't trust the stepmother." He stopped and turned his head, listening. "You need to go back to the house." It took Ayumi a minute to recognize this man as the boy who had stood next to Jasmine in the photo. He had grown up in the forest, into a forest creature himself. Whatever her father had done, these children had been in his care, and he had failed them. "I can't just leave you here, can I? I need to talk to you." Ayumi wanted to sit next to the man, to ask him the questions that had burned in her heart for so long. But her skin crawled at the sight of the naked man and the dark, crusted stains around his mouth. "I don't know how to get back. You need to come with me." The man shook his head, closed his eyes. "Follow the path. You need to go, now." All around Ayumi, Eyes blinked from the undergrowth, and she took a step back, away from the clearing. The leaves around the man rustled, fur chafing against their stems. The forest hissed and chattered, and Ayumi took a tentative step away from the answers she'd been seeking. And then she turned and ran. The trail opened again before her, the grass still flattened where she'd recently set her feet. Ayumi ran and didn't look back. Narun was lost, that much was clear. The forest had welcomed him, had changed him. But what had happened to the other children? If they hadn't gone to the stepmother, they had to be in the house. The labyrinthine halls came alive with motion, and Ayumi didn't know where to turn. Jasmine, is that you? A girl appeared in one of the corridors, but she was smaller than Jasmine it would have been. Her pigtails bobbed as she sprinted, her eyes wide and red. No tears, not in the dry house. Hope caught in Ayumi's throat as she realized this child could be the other girl from the photograph, the female half of the twins. A clatter of footfalls turned Ayumi's attention toward an adjacent corridor and two boys running toward her. Their skin was scaly, scratched open in a patchwork of dry yellow wounds. She recognized one of them from the photo. This was the other twin. Jasmine, the others are out. It's your turn now. The children stumbled into the chamber, their breathing fast and feral. The girl gained her composure first. Who are you? Her voice was parched and brittle, like the rustling of a plant left too long in the sun. Are you Yasmin's mother? The boy twin panted with his hands on his knees, and he sounded as hoarse as his sister. She's dead, right? She's one of the upside-down people. Are you dead, lady? Do you have water? Ayumi shook her head. She didn't know if her sudden vertigo was caused by the blood she'd lost after smashing the latrine, but she felt dizzy. The other boy tried to dust himself off, but the white dust-like particles on his skin and clothes held fast. Ayumi was certain she'd never seen him before. Where's Yasmin? Is she still in there? She was with my brother, the unknown boy grimaced, squeezing out every word as if he was vomiting dust. Try to help him. Badukar, that's his name. He doesn't listen. It's not his fault, but he doesn't listen. Ayumi clutched her bleeding hand and eyed the shifting corridor. Which way do I go? How can I find her? The three children pointed towards the hallway that had opened out from the door. With only a finger's breadth of water left in the bowls, the corridor became a twisted tunnel of shadows, a pinhole mouth that sucked in what little moisture was left. When Ayumi looked into that dark, sucking hole, her tongue withered in her mouth. Her skin tightened, grinding her bones against each other. If she squinted, trained her vision as far into the corridor as she could see the dry house. The upside-down house for upside-down people. The maze would close at any moment, and Jasmine wasn't anywhere to be seen. Ayumi set one foot into the hallway, then pulled herself through the aperture. The air around her didn't flow. It pulled her down. The corridors and rooms sprouted like black fungus. Resisting refraction, the light here hung from her shoulders. Sound waves crashed under her feet and fell silent. She tried to call the girl, but the name crumbled between her lips. Ayumi looked back and saw the kids staring at her, as if from worlds away, as if she had fallen into a crevice, as if she was still falling. With her last strength, she braced herself against the wall and staggered into a side passage. Didn't she hear footsteps ahead? 2 pairs of little feet? Yasmin, Ayumi called. The corridor leaned into another hall, and that hall into a chamber that mirrored the dressing room. Yasmin, please. He doesn't want to come, Auntie. Ayumi gasped at the girl before her, the girl with the same red eyes she had seen in the other children. It was certainly Jasmine, accompanied by a young shaggy-haired boy. Glancing at Ayumi before turning again, Jasmine pulled at the young boy's arm, but he giggled and planted his feet firm on the shifting ground. Ayumi hurried into the room. The boy shook his long hair as he laughed, seemingly unaware of any danger. Ayumi reached out to him, and a memory from her childhood materialized like a ghost before her, her father's strong hands pulling her off the street, out of the path of a speeding motorbike. Ayumi grabbed the boy and dragged him along by the hand towards the closing aperture, the dressing room, the 3 kids standing amidst broken glass. Come on, she pulled them into the only remaining hallway. The walls stretched like sinew, covering all openings with membranes of stone and plaster. Auntie, the children's voices came from far away, but Ayumi focused on them, moved towards them with waning energy and mounting desperation. There's no water left. Run! Ayumi pushed Jasmine ahead of her and picked the boy up by the armpits. He was heavier than she had expected, and he struggled in her grip. With no water left in the bowls, the house sucked at them. The house sucked as the blood curdled on Ayumi's wounds. She slowed, fell behind Jasmine. The corridor around them contracted. The jaws of the house clenched shut. All right, and that's the end of that chapter. Now I'll hand it back to you, Selena.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
That was great. It's currently about 30 degrees in my part of Canada, and I still have chills. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I will pass the stage on to Mike for our interview.
Well, all right. Give me a second to recoil from that disturbing final image you just dropped on us, Dennis. The house swallowing, basically, the young character. I have all sorts of questions for you, Dennis, and I bet there'll be some from the audience that might come up that our moderators will read out of the chat. So if anyone's has a question that they want to ask Dennis, be sure to put it in the chat room. My first question, I guess, is going to be very general. Dennis, can you, reading your bio and knowing a little bit about what you do, you know, you're a working climate activist, researcher, you're doing good work for the earth. I was wondering if you could talk about tell us more about your background for the people that aren't aware of it, and how does that inform your writing, particularly in this book?
Thank you. That's a good question, of course. Yeah, so I do work for a non-profit think tank called Sri Lanka Trust, which was founded in Sri Lanka and set up in Sri Lanka and has its main base in Sri Lanka. And so I'm not an activist. What I do is mostly the research part and policy analysis. So it's a lot of sitting around and reading things, but we also do some work on the ground where we like work with farming communities and youth groups and coastal communities in Sri Lanka, for example, on mangrove restoration and in farming communities on climate risk and how it impacts them and climate migrants. And so a lot of that, of course, informs my writing. It's extremely interesting to see like the different perspectives that are there, the different issues and challenges and the different ways people's lives intersect and interact with climate change. Which, like for some, it's like something far away, like it's a background concern. For others, it's very immediate. They're like all like so many different aspects to it, and that is something. Yeah, I think there could be more awareness of just of the pure scale and the far-reaching nature of climate change. So that's something that in my writing I try to maybe explore and spread a bit. So. There is, of course, other people working on climate fiction, and there has been very interesting books published, not least of all by Stelliform Press. But of course, I think it's a tiny fraction of literature and art that is being published. So I think to focus more on that, because it is such a worldwide and global challenge that can be seen in all kinds of countries and all kinds of contexts, something that's important to me. And I think it comes, of course, partially from my work. Like many years ago, I used to work in theater, and at that time, there were a lot of theater elements that featured in my writing. So I just tend to write about things that I work on also, but climate change in addition has this, what theater didn't have, like this additional urgency and importance that I feel is something that really needs to be highlighted.
Well, I think a lot of writers turn to fiction as a way to sort of send messages that maybe they're not allowed to in everyday life, or to kind of speak a truth that they aren't hearing from official discourses. Would you say that you're doing something along those lines? Are you speaking some truth that your everyday life doesn't allow you to speak?
I mean, maybe there's some truth to that. Although I think I have relatively wide freedom to talk about different issues, but of course there are ways I have to talk about it in a professional context. But for me, it's more not about being allowed, but not being able to actually talk about it in a way that is not like a literary way. Like for me, the writing is a way to actually explore these things for myself as well as for others in a way that I consciously can't easily do, but that in a roundabout way, and especially in this weird mode of writing that I'm drawn to, helps me to really get things, strangely enough, to get things clear by making them first weird and alien and defamiliarized. And
I love that. Make things clear by making them defamiliarized and alien.
It kind of works.
It does. Well, I think that's why science fiction writers often are scientists who have more to say about what they're researching, and they turn to science fiction. So with horror writing, it's a different kind of venue to turn to from your research. So to explore the dark side of what is already imminently dark, in its very kind of nature, if I can use that word, is really interesting to me. It's really intriguing. So can you perhaps talk a little bit more about horror fiction? Like, why is that the zone you go to when you're doing your creative writing and maybe addressing these issues in a different way than you normally would?
So I think in terms of like the climate writing, I think it kind of lends itself to horror. I don't think horror is the only way to talk about it. And, I'm trying to explore different perspectives also on climate change and different ways to talk about it. But of course, climate change in a way is like this horror that is not like a creature stalking people, but it's like this very like crawling, creeping kind of thing that's everywhere, like more like a cosmic horror kind of thing that that really impacts people's lives, even if they're not aware of it, and then that they can run into in like all kinds of contexts. And in the House of Drought, I feel I try to do this by having these different characters encountering the house and getting like sucked into the story of the house, and sometimes literally into the house, who are actually just trying to do something completely different. Like no one really comes to the house except the framework story's filmmaker. No one from the main characters comes to the house to explore the house. People come for different reasons, to make a life there. They have their own like family issues, to find her father, because they got lost and stuck. So they're actually dealing with completely different issues, and then the House of Drought kind of happens to them, or they get drawn into this whole House of Drought, and also into the stepmother's machinations. And that is something that I think with climate change is pretty much the same. People are like people try to live their normal lives. They have different concerns, like they need a job, they have concerns about paying their mortgages or stuff, and then they encounter climate change. So I was thinking, if I had actually lived in Germany the last 5 years, maybe I would have written a book called The House of Flood, because the area where my family lives has been hit by last year by the flooding in Germany. And, so suddenly it's an area that has never had flooding, at least not the last 100 years. So no one had really expected that, but then basically suddenly people had to deal with like their houses being completely destroyed, relatives being injured or dead, and like all kinds of things that is also, I think, and that is attributable to climate change. So that is also an example of climate change really coming like a kind of where it really has a horror aspect. It came in the night, it took away a lot of things people had. So I think in that way, climate change lends itself to the horror genre.
Nice.
But,
yeah, I mean, just I'm still, you got me with that whole House of Flood. You should write that. Yeah, it's like the opposite of dehydration is flooding. It's all about death. But anyway, I love what you're saying about climate fiction and how it's the creeping horror of like this unknown future that's like a dark cloud coming our way, right? It's slowly coming over us, enveloping us, and we're always already in it. We just don't necessarily consciously think about it, and perhaps out of fear, we disavow the circumstances that we're living in, right? So there's always an uncanny aura on this planet at this particular time, and I think your work reminds us of that, right? It kind of forces us not to repress it, and to kind of consider it, and to sit with our fear. So bravo.
I would just add, it's all of these things, but also, of course, it's not just like a horror. So I think they're also like things where you can look at it positively, or like as an opportunity to change certain things. Like a lot of the things, the ways we're doing things, maybe they can change. And I think where also like this colonial legacy comes in, where capitalism comes in, and like these different aspects, where maybe the house was built by someone who didn't know the land. It was like forced upon the community. It was forced upon the ecosystem. And that is also why it is so destructive, and why it's a kind of nightmare. But there's also like this implication, I think, that there are also other possibilities, and characters get stuck in the house, but it's not inevitable. And the last words of the book are actually like about the possibility of letting the like in nature back into the house, basically, and what kind of transformation could come out of that. So yeah, just to add a few additional thoughts.
That's of course, a great point. Transformation is scary to some people, and maybe it shouldn't be, right? There's positive outcomes of change. And horror often kind of unravels all this stuff and kind of lets the reader kind of consider their own anxieties, whether they're realistic, justified, maybe they should let go of some things. And I think your book dramatizes some of these struggles. What's interesting about your book too is that it has multiple narratives. I mean, it's kind of reminiscent of House of Leaves, right? I'm sure that's one of your inspirations. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yes.
But it's also, with these, let's call them monstrous figures. I don't know what you would call them, but like the sap mother, and who ends up being a positive, creature, and the house itself being this evil, upside down, uncanny space, this construct of possibly evil, if I could use that word. It's really interesting, but it's all about these inhabitants of the house, the transitory nature of life, and occupying a space that's a contested space, a difficult space, right? It's on the edge of the forest where the sap mother resides, but it's also, by the paddy fields that are decimated and drying up, and it's like about convergences, I suppose, of different people in time and space. So I guess this is a weird way of getting to my question, but can you talk a little bit about the architecture of your story and how, it's not just a work of metafiction, but maybe there's more to this that might not be apparent to the audience. So can you talk a little bit about the structure of your book, why you chose to have multiple narratives, and the kind of 5-act structure you have going on here?
Yeah, of course. I'm actually not that good at interpreting why I do the things that I do. It's like a partially conscious, but also partially unconscious process. But of course, there's some thought that went into it. And partially, so the different characters and the different timelines are, I think, because I really wanted to highlight and explore like the different perspectives that are there, the different ways people have to interact with the house, and also with climate change, and with all these other topics that are linked to it. And to also have like this aspect of something that has all these connections, like it is connected to the paddy fields, which is like a human kind of system, like an agricultural system. It's connected to the forest, which is a natural ecosystem, but then in the forest, there are also like, of course, humans who are like extracting resources from the forest or living in the forest. there are places like abandoned temples that is mentioned a couple of times, that is in the forest nearby. There are animals that are sighted. So I wanted to have this kind of way to bring these different things together and make clear that it's all interconnected. So it's not, we can't just talk about any of these in isolation. I don't think I would want, like, if the novel only had the stepmother but not the house, it would be incomplete. If it only had the house but not the stepmother, it would also be incomplete. And if it wouldn't have like the surrounding communities in the village of Anasakandu, it also would miss something. So I think all these this all comes back again to climate change having these different facets, and how they are shaped by like the colonial history that is there, and by the livelihoods that people have, and by all kinds of different aspects. Yeah, maybe that. And then, of course, there is a structure inside the chapters, and also times inside scenes where it basically is upside down, where it starts at the climax and then goes back. So that, of course, is also connected to the gravity, the influence of the house that kind of twists things and turns them around and turns them in on itself, just like the house itself is. Maybe the house at some point wasn't like this, or could have been different, but now it is definitely in this completely distorted way. And if it can be fixed or how, that is an open question. I think
Well, yeah, it's clearly post-colonial in that kind of manner. So again, hats off to you. It's really a strongly written and smart contemporary book. There's something too, though, about your book that I would say is not a throwback. That's the wrong word. But can you talk about perhaps folk horror? Does that influence your work? Are you a fan of folk horror films or anything of that nature? Or would you locate this more in the realm of just weird horror? I'm not sure.
I mean, that's of course a question how this is defined. I feel for me often weird fiction or weird horror is something that is not incompatible with other subgenres, maybe even more like a mode in a genre, but they're different. I mean, they're very valid different viewpoints on this. And in the end, it's also not maybe the most important thing. But I think the folk horror aspect is of course there. So I thought about this also. There are very interesting like Sri Lankan folk stories and ghost stories, but I didn't want to utilize these because it's not, so I'm, as a outsider, I don't have the complete, like, it's not my mythology, right, that I can really take in. So I, like, there's some echoes maybe in the stepmother and in the story, but what I try to do is build like a new mythology, a new myth for this book that features something separate, that is set in Sri Lanka, but it's not like a Sri Lankan mythology that I'm taking without really understanding it.
So you're not necessarily. I think I hear you saying you're trying not to appropriate the culture.
Yes.
But you do want to involve it.
Yes, yeah, kind of, yes. I think that's what I'm trying to say, yes. Because of course, I mean, it's like I'm living here and have been living here for years now, but I'm still like a foreigner, right? I'm not Sri Lankan, and I will never have that complete understanding of like the cultural aspects, and I would not pretend to have that also. It's definitely not after 5 years, but also after 20, probably not. Because I'm German, and of course there are like things I think also that one needs to be very conscious of as a foreigner writing about a different country, especially in my case, like a foreigner from a global north country living in a global south country and writing about something like that. Right. So that I don't know if you have a question on that also later, but
well, I mean, I'd love to hear more about how you kind of how you navigate that kind of landmine of writing about a culture that you're immersed in, but would not say you're from originally. And so you're like an outsider, a stranger in a strange land, as they say.
Yeah, I would. I would maybe say I navigated by not actually writing so much about the culture. So I actually would say this is not a novel about Sri Lanka as such. It's a novel set in Sri Lanka that explores thematic areas that are important for Sri Lanka, like climate change, colonialism, nature versus like the coexistence of nature and humans. But it's not like uniquely Sri Lankan issues, which is what I stayed away from, because these are not my stories to tell. So I consciously didn't go into any social, cultural, religious, ethnic, historical details as such. There's of course a historical background with different time zones, but I'm not trying to explore some of these aspects, because that's for someone else to do, who is actually an insider on this. Well, I'm an outsider, and so one other thing I try to incorporate to make this very clear, also, and to acknowledge this, is to have this whole framework story, which is also an outsider's perspective, which is kind of framing the different timeline stories, which is basically like a German filmmaker who's trying to make a movie about climate change and gets fascinated by the house and has experiences a lot of the issues that come with being an outsider and trying to basically tell a story about a place that is not truly theirs. I mean, I'm trying to, I'm living here, and my wife is here, my son is here, my colleagues and friends are here. We have my dogs and cats are here, and I have been living here and going through many of the challenging times that have been happening in the last years. But still, of course, I'm a foreigner. I don't speak fluent Sinhala. I don't or Tamil, and obviously, I don't have that cultural understanding. So I think it's best to not pretend to have that and not to try to appropriate it, but to make it to stick to certain issues and explore them in this context without trying to overstep my boundaries and tell stories that are not mine to tell.
I love that. That mindfulness is a lesson I think any writers listening to this should be mindful of. That sounded circular, but we need to think about these things when we're representing cultures. Particularly, as you said, it's not my story to tell. I like that phrase. It's not my story to tell, which kind of begs the question, what is your story to tell? So, like, Dennis, to what degree would you say your novella is autobiographical? Is it the documentary filmmaker approach to the story, or something else?
I think so. What are my stories to tell? So what is something that I can tell, I think, are these is so climate change, of course, is a universal issue. It affects or will affect everyone to some extent, and something that affects me and that I also work on. And so that is something I feel I can talk about and should talk about. And in that sense, it's also autobiographical. It wasn't so much at the time when I wrote it, since the floods hadn't happened yet, but now even I have been very directly affected by it. With most of my family living in this valley that was completely flooded and destroyed. Yeah, so I think on the one hand, the universal things or these wide-ranging things, and of course, colonialism is something that Germany is on the other side of. Sri Lanka wasn't a German colony, but Germany definitely benefits from the whole neo-colonial system and from the whole capitalist setup of the world markets, and that's something, of course, I have benefited from growing up in Germany, and that's something that it's interesting also to see a lot of differences between how many things are very easy for me as a German to do, like traveling to places and doing certain things that are actually very difficult from the other side. Yeah, so it's autobiographical in a way, but more like in a roundabout way. More about the.
Well, I love it.
It's clear.
That is clear. I think it's hard because I think all fiction has parts of ourselves in it that we're not always aware of, but we're kind of navigating, managing, juggling. Sometimes what we're not writing about is actually the issue. But anyway, it's very, this is art. It's all strange. Were there topics that you felt were totally off limits for you? Like, did you hit a spot where you're like, oh, I could write this, but I don't think I better put that into my story? Because I know myself, sometimes I'm always treading into taboo areas. And there are certain things I try not to do because just on policy, I feel like they're negative. They're not really reflective of me, even though I think it's my job to kind of be bold and go places other people might not want to go with their imagination as a horror writer. So where do you kind of hit that boundary line between like where you want to stop short and maybe not write about something? Is there anything off limits for you?
That's a good policy that you have, I think. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything in the term of like the horror itself that I feel is completely off limits. It just has to be matching the tone of the overall story and like the purpose of the story. So I usually don't have a lot of like very gory scenes, but I'm not like, I don't have if it would be demanded by the story, I wouldn't be opposed to writing like a gory scene. That is fine. For the House of Drought, it's more like a ghost story kind of thing. It's not about like limbs being torn and whatnot. But of course, in writing this, there was a lot of hard limits about things I didn't want to talk about, which are mostly like the specific Sri Lankan like aspects and issues that are related to like ethnicity, to religion, to social and cultural things, and the history that is there of the Civil War and everything. So purposefully, the village and the house, they're not like clearly located. They're like a bit vague in their location on the island, and all the like some of the names are a bit like defamiliarized, to use that word again, both the German and the Sri Lankan ones. So it's not so as not to put the attention on like very specific conflicts that might be there, but to focus it on the things I wanted to explore and or that the novella is about. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of hard limits in that sense. The things, again, that are not my stories to tell. In terms of writing horror, I don't think there's a specific limit. It's just, for me, it needs to come naturally from the story and match the tone of the story. And often that turns for me out not to be like too graphically and too bloody, but I wouldn't rule out that in a future story that might be something that comes up.
Yeah, I'm with you. The story kind of sets its own kind of limits and rules, so to speak, of the game of fiction. So yeah, I understand what you're talking about totally. Though I myself probably go more gory than I should. To me, often because it's goofy. I think it's I don't know. There's often a tinge of dark humor to what I'm doing. Your book is fairly serious, I would say.
It's true.
So what you've got going on here really matches the tone. And you talk about ghosts. The hauntology of what you're doing is spot on. So fans of hauntology should read this book. But speaking of that, are there books that you would recommend to people who are fans of this title? If somebody reads your story and falls in love with it, obviously they should read your other works, but are there other authors out there that you would recommend, either as someone who influenced you before you wrote it, or just somebody that you think is really a hot writer right now, is like, really doing great work that people should be reading? Any recommendations?
That's always a good question. There's so many. It's always hard to recommend. I mean, a lot of the classics, of course, are there, but I don't think I need to go through these. Like, there are a lot of classics of weird fiction, the classic of horror fiction, that have greatly influenced me, I think, and also people like Kafka or others. House of Leaves is for the big inspiration in general. I really like this whole meta aspect of it, that it really creates the labyrinth and the maze in its like as a book itself, without and then to have these different layers. So I like a lot of these stories that have different layers and different viewpoints, and that are kind of a patchwork of perspectives. Yeah, of course, now, as usual, nothing comes to mind, but I'm sure there are hundreds. I can actually, there's a friend of mine who is writing, who is calling himself a strange geologist, and he is exploring strange things in a very interesting way. So his texts are really like straightforward texts. They don't have a narrative structure as such. They're more collages of different characters, different impressions, different settings that come together in a kind of dreamlike fashion. Daniel Ableev is his name. I would definitely recommend to check him out. He's I can put his name in the chat also.
Yeah, he's worked on the novella with you, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Yes, yes.
I've dealt with him a few times.
Oh, really? Really? Okay.
Yeah, he interviewed me once. It was hilarious.
Yeah, he interviews a lot of people, and it's always interesting. Like, he brings out really interesting answers by the question he asks.
Yes. Well, great. And Selena, are we almost out of time? Wow,
we are. Yep. So if anyone
already,
yeah, we're just 2 minutes to the hour. So if anyone does have any questions, if there's questions in the audience, now would be the time to put those in the chat or unmute yourself if you are comfortable doing that.
Ooh. It may be hard. Yeah, if people haven't read the book yet, they might not know it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the book just went out. We shipped the pre-orders, I guess, about a week ago. So yeah, people might not have had a chance. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that fantastic interview. It was great. Even as the book's editor, I learned some things about the process. So that was really nice. I do have just a few housekeeping things before we wrap up. And the first is one of the more fun housekeeping things always, which is to give away a prize. So we have a little prize to give away to say thank you to those who came and supported Dennis and his new novella, as well as, of course, showing some love for Stelliform. We really appreciate it. So the winner of the prize will receive a tote from Little Ghosts Bookstore, which is a brand new bookstore in Toronto, which is fully focused on horror and other dark fiction. It's amazing. If you're ever in Toronto, do be sure to visit it. So you'll get a tote from Little Ghosts, and you'll also get a copy of Octavia Cade's The Impossible Resurrection of Grief, which is this beautiful book right here, and also an ARC of, that's an advanced review copy of Rebecca Campbell's Arboreality, which is quite pretty as well, and that one's coming out in September of this year. So let's see, Dennis, I'll get you to pick a number between 1 and 10, and we'll find our winner.
All right, that's a lot of responsibility. Let's go with 7.
7, okay. Our winner is Marissa Van Uden. All right, so Marissa, you can send me an email at query@stelliform.press and send me your address, and we'll make arrangements to get your prize to you. So thank you, everybody. It has been a pleasure to bring folks together for this launch. And thanks again to Mike Arnzen for such a great interview and for helping us to spread the word about the book. Be sure to go to gorlitz.com to check out Mike's projects and sign up for that award-winning newsletter. And congratulations, of course, to Dennis on the publication of a truly excellent and ambitious novella. This is a book that's as complex and beautiful as it is chilling and disorienting. And of course, raising these kinds of feelings in readers while also compelling us to face the reason for our fear or discomfort is a really important thing. If you don't already have a copy, you can grab the link to the Stelliform bookstore in the chat and get a copy printed on recycled paper. So only the copies that come from us are printed on recycled paper at this time. Of course, we're always working to expand our recycled paper production, but at this time, only from us. So the book is also available anywhere else that you can get books. So as we wrap up, I wanted to say thank you to Erin Julian and Kristen Shaw for helping out today. And finally, thank you to everyone who joined us to help bring the book into the world. We'll be hosting more launch celebrations this summer and fall. If you'd like to keep in touch with Stelliform and stay informed about our new releases, be sure to sign up for our newsletter, and that link is in the chat as well. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Our next title is coming out in August, and that's Weird Fishes by Ray Maurice. There's the beautiful cover for that one. If you like your underwater fantasy, both mind-bending and sassy, you don't want to miss that one. Finally, Dennis, I would like the last words of the launch to be yours. So do you have any final thoughts for those who are here today or for those who watch this later?
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't want to drag things out. I really just want to thank you, Selena, and Stelliform Press, and also Mike. I really learned a lot about my book today. It's always good to talk with someone and get asked very intelligent questions and get good feedback on that. So I'm really happy. I think it was a great launch event, and I really hope people will enjoy the book, and maybe I'll write the House of Flood one day and publish that as well.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I look forward to that. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.